the day going?
Pretty good.
It's going pretty good.
Yeah.
Hey, it's beautiful here.
I think it's something to do with the
Okay. Should be there soon. Apologies. I thought I was coming into like a waiting room first, so I'm sorry.
Not a problem.
I'm just truly walking right off the set, so
Better than that.
okay. So once I get there, I'll be there in 30 seconds. I'll obviously leave a ton of time for you all to ask questions because I want this to be the most interactive that it can be. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just because I now know that I'm for sure doing world news tonight, so I want to make sure to get all of your questions answered before I have to book it up to a different place. Okay, we can do this here. Let me actually shut my door so it doesn't get distracting. Okay. All right, so I don't know how much you all know about me, but I've obviously chased, and I know this is all about chasing, and I've chased since I was 19 years old, and it's been more than 23 years now of being out in storms, and that's been my dream. I grew up like so many of you, I'm sure, and like so many people, falling in love with the atmosphere and with weather. I've watched storms come across Lake Michigan when I was 8. I spent a whole summer, one summer doing that, and just the magic of and the puzzle that I wanted to put together that is the atmosphere has never stopped. So ever since that summer back in the mid 80s, and it was a really stormy summer, I really was obsessed with weather and with forecasting weather and how did people do that. And I had zero interest in being like those people on TV because who wants to do that? I just really just knew I loved the puzzle part. And I started, I always remember going to the encyclopedia in elementary school and like pulling the volumes that had anything to do with weather. And that was my passion. Like now I have a 7-year-old and I see he's starting to become passionate about certain things. And it's like you get really glommed onto something as a kid. Well, mine never stopped. And so then when I was in high school, I distinctly remember seeing Twister and having finally a vision and like an actual thing to hold on to say, now that's what I want to do. And so like so many people were inspired by that movie, and that was just at the right time. I went and chose a college to storm chase, and that's why I went to Valparaiso University, and just enjoyed greatly my experience there. But the year after, and this is all integral to the reason why I ended up chasing and won't stop, the year after we had a derecho in 98 in West Michigan, and there was 130-mile-per-hour winds, and that theater where I had seen Twister got wrecked. And so that combination just ever more solidified who I was going to be and what I was going to do with my life. So that's why I went and studied it. That's why I chose Valparaiso, so I could chase storms for college credit, and I've enjoyed it ever since. And really, like once I got there, I had a professor who said, I think you should check out communications of this and try broadcasting. I was like, nah, it's not for me. Sorry, sir. And he just kept pushing, and then saying he really believed that, because I would do like the debriefs before or after we would do like a day chase. And he would say, I think you really have a knack for it. Okay, whatever you say. And then he kind of forced me into trying an internship, and I got one. And I did coincidentally got an internship with James Spann. And James Spann, if you know him within the weather world, is just a king. And so I came away from that internship being really inspired to know that there were people who were outstanding meteorologists and scientists who were also on television. And I thought, well, what if I can do both? And that's kind of what I've become. I always call myself like James Spann and Helen Hunt's character Joe had a baby. That's who I am. So that's how I come to you now, and how fortunate I've been to be able to keep growing in this field and chase all the way through and be in before, during, and after so many of the biggest storms of our lifetime. So here for your questions.
So I know you have a really good mental health advocate for people. What would you say to people in our field regarding mental health?
Well, I will say storm chasing and just the general idea surrounding it is not the healthiest. Not, I don't mean the idea of it. I mean the physical toll that it takes, and that is always number one to me. Is if you do not take care of yourself, sleep being the most important, and prioritizing that. I know it's so boring and so cliche, but it really is the foundation. Water. I sound like my dad, and then nutritious food and activity, which none of those things are obvious for chasing storms. And so I think that you have to make concerted effort to be extremely thoughtful and deliberate when you and intentional with everything you do when you go to do anything within meteorology, but especially chasing. So I'd say that foundation of all of those baseline things needs to be there. Then when it comes to the mental health, there's so many parts that I've gone through, and both on a personal side, I've learned so much throughout my journey because I wasn't always caring for those things that I just mentioned. But I also have genetics that play into it, and I did not put enough gravity to the storms that I was living in my brain. I really kept trying to compare, and there's so many really fun analogies with mental health and chasing, but just like you can't compare one hurricane to another hurricane, you cannot compare one person's mental health, the expression of, say, by or borderline personality disorder like I have. You can't say, well, mine is just like that, but you certainly can learn about it and about the things that you can do. So I often now, and what chasing and meteorology has taught me is, if we could just take what we have done with post tornado, say, when a tornado comes through, that is trauma. And people, I've watched them, whether it's a wildfire or a flood or a tornado or a hurricane, doesn't matter what type of disaster it is, people process that trauma faster and better than almost any other. And I always wondered, like, why are people so graceful with nature? Like I wouldn't be, not necessarily, but I think that they are. And part of it is, number one, you can't say it didn't happen. If someone loses their child or has a stillborn, you can kind of go through life not telling that story. You can kind of avoid. With a tornado, your house is gone. There is no avoiding. So that trauma, the immediate, you have to go through it to get through it, is there. And I wish we could do that with our own mental health and just really let people know, like, listen, I just had a tornado. Oh, I had a tornado too. Oh, what do we do together? And that's what happens in these. Is I watch, in the week after, I usually get a pretty good glimpse of the human element after a disaster, and people go through those grieving processes really fast. They go through the feelings of loss, of traumatization, the sadness, the anger, and then they usually pretty quickly, and this is why news could be very cliche, they come together. They come together for a reason, because they've all been through that trauma. They have a shared trauma. If we could do that with our mental health and treat our mental health that way, then you and I, who have both had that shared tornado of life, can give each other resources. Just like they would say to each other, hey, what's your insurance doing about X? We would say, hey, what's your insurance doing about X, or medication, or inpatient treatment, whatever it is. I wish we could apply everything that we do in the kind of heavy support right after, to our mental health. That said, I think what I see in mental health a lot, and this is what I've been talking a lot more about, is just like in storms, all of the aid comes right away. Everybody's there for a good month after, and they're like, oh man. And then we kind of all move on to the next one and we forget. And it's not just the media. This is what happens in grief when people lose people. Everybody's got too much food. Everybody's dropping food off of your doorstep. Then a month later, when it hits you again, you're like, where'd everybody go? So this happens in disasters, and it happens in mental health. So that commitment of having a team and of having people even just hear you, even just know that this is something that you're still learning through and growing through, is really important. So that's something else that, both in disaster, because this does happen in disaster where people don't maintain the support, and they may need it for years to come. We're actually thinking about doing a story about that, because there's so much that gets supported right away, and then a year or two later, it's like, where'd everybody go? I still can't function. And so hopefully we can do that with our mental too.
So, so how did storm chasing influence you to make you choose your career, what you wanted to do for meteorology?
I mean, it was the foundation of it. It was everything. If I wouldn't have had the opportunity, you know, I always wonder because I kept growing in television, and once I got to Chicago, I was like, this is great and all, but I really still want to chase. And I hadn't really chased for 4 years or so. And then Discovery Channel called and said, we have this show called Storm Chasers. Would you think about coming on? And I was like, I'm familiar with the show. Yes, please, you know, and if that wouldn't have given me that little bump to get over the hump of kind of being in a studio for so long, I don't know if I would have made it. So thankfully, when I went to apply for this job, um, the president of ABC News saw that I was different that way and had a lot of different experiences than a lot of folks do that come from just a studio. And he very much wanted me to take that into my job here, which I have. On every type of disaster and much more than just tornadoes than what I had done, you know, in college and in Storm Chasers.
So what is your biggest challenge balancing it all?
What is my biggest challenge and what? Sorry, it cut out.
Balancing everything. So balancing life,
Balancing.
career.
I don't do it well. I think I prioritize and I try to try to communicate that prioritization. So especially with my family, I'm on the road a lot and I always let them know if this is going to be something that's too much, you tell me. And, you know, I communicate clearly too. And like my mother-in-law last year made a family vacation at the end of September. And I was like, it's almost like a magnet, an inevitable truth that I'm going to be called away. And sure enough, it was Ian. And so I have to work very hard on figuring out where those priorities are, communicating them, but also saying this is what I have to do and kind of pre-warning folks. And especially in that case, this wasn't something that was for my child's birthday or something. It was like a gathering. And I said, well, that sounds great. And I did go, but I only got there for a day. I had to meet everybody there after covering Ian for a few days. So I think, but then on a day to day is just about caring for myself and them and prioritizing that, but then also making choices. I'm sitting in this room with Samantha, who would laugh at that question because she doesn't think that I do very well with my calendar sometimes, meaning that I overstack it a bit. But I think knowing what you can handle and then allowing yourself to go a little too far and then pulling back and then realizing where that is a great start. And just it's not about balance, it's about focus.
Oh, hey, Ginger, so I'm planning on going into broadcast journalism. And so I also suffer from, generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder. So looking up to you 10 years ago, I remember watching Good Morning America every morning. I mean, I still do. So how do you cope with the stress and pressure of being a public figure and a meteorologist while on national TV on a big morning show?
See, I think I actually learned the most, and people vilify social media, and I think we should in many ways because there's a lot of bad stuff that's out there. But I learned very early in the early days of Twitter, I had to learn how to create a fence around myself, to actually think about when those attacks and those things were coming. I was able to fortify my own identity, which is not something that most of us have done a very good job at, and not to our, it's not our fault. Our societally, we haven't been taught it. Emotional regulation, we have not been taught. And so a lot of these things were not part of our education. They weren't part of our family structure because that's just not what we've done. In a general rule, of course, there are people who are great at this and who are just better laid out, as a family goes. But I'd say in general, most of us were not given those tools. And so I had to learn them, and I learned them through having to be resilient to people, which is a strange way, probably not the healthiest, but it did help me greatly in realizing that it's not just in Twitter where I can throw that fence up and say, wait a minute, that person just has an opinion. I'm going to let that stay on their side of the fence, and I'm going to fortify and figure out what is on this side. But it works in life. So I was able to apply a lot of the identity fortifications that I learned about myself once I got away from just Twitter itself. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that there's within the broadcasting industry, I think that you have to either go in with a very strong identity and ability to emotionally regulate based on what other people will be saying about you, because they will have something to say, good, bad, and then to realize that you really can't believe any of it, which is very hard to do, right? And I think I've gotten really good at doing that, but also being open enough to grow and know that I am far from perfect. My new thing that I joke with my team about is I am so imperfect, but I am always right. Because within science, I make mistakes, but I'm usually right about that. And then have humor around it, because if you don't, I think you won't make it.
Thank you, yeah.
I got one. I can't figure out how to properly word this question, so just stop me when you know what I'm asking. How exactly does your job happen? Like, not every station has a person who's, courageous / crazy enough to actually on the field and be totally incomprehensible against the wind and a microphone. But
Yeah.
there's people like you, and I've seen someone, I'm forgetting the name of in the moment. Like, do you just go up to the station manager or whatever and say, hey, I want to be the resident crazy person, or is it something more in depth than that?
Yeah, I mean, it probably started that way. Like I said, when I started here, they had never had anyone like me. They'd not had meteorologists. They had only had one back behind the scenes meteorologist. He'd been here for 30 years and he just made graphics, but nobody on TV had been a meteorologist, and definitely not a storm chaser. And so when I came for that first interview, Ben Sherwood was the president's name at the time. He said, "What would you do different?" Which is an interesting question in an interview. How would you change what we do now? And I was really honest, and I said, "You guys just damage chase, and we're at the point in the science where we can be there days before there's a deadly tornado outbreak. We can be there during it to capture that tornado, and then we can be there after and do what you've done forever." And it wasn't just a knock on just here. It was that's what pretty much everybody was doing. And it was like, why? We have a whole show called Storm Chasers. We can do this. And so he was very keyed in on the idea that I wanted to be that person. And so I told him, let me try it for you. Let me show you what it can look like. And we did, and we built and built and built. And it's funny you use that kind of idea of you're just a one of the other people on my team said, kind of in a funny text exchange after a big storm, I said, "Thank you all so much. I could have done it without you." I meant I couldn't have done it without you, but it was a mistype in the rain and the blowing wind. And he's like, he said, "Yeah, you're just, without us, you're just some crazy lady yelling at the wind," which is about right. So I'd say that that's the other thing that I did is as I went through, I realized how much I needed help back here. And I've accrued this fantastic team of meteorologists who can make sure that the editorial surrounding, because I'm going to say everything right on my end. Remember, I'm always right. No, but I'm going to do what I know in my core and my base, but I needed other people to help guide the rest of everybody who's never done this before and never seen anybody do this before, so that it didn't come off wrong, so that it didn't, no inaccuracies could be found. And that was a huge push. And we've kept building. And now we went from Gerard, who was that one, he retired, and we have 7. And it's really exciting to think that you can have a place with so many meteorologists, scientists that can keep growing this brand of it. I don't think it's crazy. I think it's just appropriate coverage. I think it's the moment winds go above 70, I'm not here to die. I go inside and I cover it from inside. Like, I know the thresholds of what is safe and what's comfortable, and I never push beyond that, because I also wouldn't want it on my record of putting someone else in a dangerous situation, my photographer or the audio person. And so I'm always really cognizant of that. I'm always do a ton of research before I go into a storm. How are we going to, Idalia is a great example. I loved being an eye wall. I've done an eye wall of Michael, the Cat 5 years ago, of Ian, last year I was right in the eye wall. I'm always going to do that if I've done the research of what's the building made out of, what code is it up to, what are the pylons? How deep do they go? What are they made out of? I've done a lot of research in what survives the, the eye wall of a Cat 4 or 5 and what doesn't. So this year with Idalia, I felt really not confident in the structures that were offered as places to be or stay. And so I said no. And I said, let's just stay down where we know there's going to be significant flooding, because Treasure Island, I've done several stories on erosion there. And sure enough, it was plenty to be able to showcase that a hurricane was happening and not be in Keaton Beach that has no structure that I feel comfortable with that wouldn't wash away. And so that's kind of a joke, but not joke too, is, during Michael, we first showed up and the only rooms they had were in Apalachicola, were on the bottom floor of a Best Western, surrounded by trees. And I was like, I'm not going to die in a Best Western in Apalachicola. This is not how it ends. And so we made the move, found a condo building that was fortified, hurricane-proof windows and doors. Granted, it was in where the eye wall would be coming on shore, but I was like, I feel better here than I do in that Apalachicola Best Western. And so I'm going to make choices like that, where I do indeed go up to a manager and say, this is what I think is best or not best. And then of course I'll follow anybody else within my team that has something to say, not follow, but I'll take into account what they have to say. And we all work together to make sure that safety is first, but obviously translating the gravity of a storm like that is also there. And we were able to do that safely.
So it seems like your first love was chasing and the puzzle. How do you keep up with the science?
So aside from reading, obviously reading, my husband jokes all the time because like when my Physics Today shows up, he's like, your Geek Weekly arrived. I do a lot of reading still. I try to go to the conferences when I can. And what's been nice is I have developed relationships within the industry. And so I've made this practice now of people that I've known forever. Russ Schumacher was he was the grade above me in meteorology school, and he is now the state climatologist of Colorado. So I catch up with Russ quarterly. I have made friends with Marty Ralph, who's at Scripps, and he studies the atmospheric rivers. And I'll just make phone calls. And it's so funny because in one of my internships with a guy named Tom Skilling, I don't know if you all are familiar, he's a big deal in Chicago. Yeah. I used to, during that internship, I remember thinking, man, that guy's on the phone a lot. He was on the phone all day. And I'd always be listening and he'd just be having conversations, but the conversations always turned to weather, climate, and data. And he was utilizing sources. I mean, in the epic way of doing meteorological journalism, there is no better way than having friends. And so I've accrued this really nice Rolodex of people that I will keep doing that. And I keep making those connections, because just like every business, it's not about networking for some future job even. It's about what I can bring now. And there's always something happening. And then they know that I'm looking for that. So sometimes they'll reach out to me and say, did you know what's going on? I mean, the reason I did the story on cloud seeding last year was because I was talking to Russ and he was like, have you seen what's happening in cloud seeding? Like they're adding hundreds of new ground cloud seeders. And I was like, what? I didn't know that, and I wouldn't have read that in a publication because it hadn't been published. And that's my favorite type of journalism to do, is to bring someone something and bring someone somewhere where no one has been, no one has done, and nobody has any clue that's happening yet. And we get to actually break news. We did that with the lithium mine when nobody has been to that commercially operating lithium mine. And I was covering the transition to batteries and what is that going to look like. And 3 years ago, we decided to do that. And then it opened up this whole thing. We went to the first cobalt mine in America, which now has been put on pause, by the way. But just really interesting stories that all come from those sources. And I guess that's what Tom Skilling was doing, was sourcing, because we can't all know it all, and we can't all educate ourselves in exactly the right places. But what I end up doing is saying, oh, I'm going to learn everything I can about cloud seeding today. And then I was in touch with 20 different scientists that have been working on it for the last 20 years. And it was like reading every journal for the last 20 years. So I'd say that's a big way that I get those done.
Nice. Awesome.
So you mentioned being almost persuaded into going into broadcast journalism. And as you're lucky enough to work for the one and only David Muir, among other well-known journalists at ABC News, how do you apply their skills that you've learned while working with them to being an on-air meteorologist? Because typically you need that background in journalism.
Yeah, I had to learn it just by experience. So that was what was, I will often tell people, you know, in meteorology, the last thing I ever wanted to do was cover a house fire. But within a year after graduating, that's what I was doing 3 days a week. House fires, murders, nothing that had to do with meteorology. And being thrown into, you know, that just because I was the weekend weather person was the best training. I then learned and wish, this is the one thing I often tell people, I wish I would have asked more questions. I was so worried about knowing everything and not looking stupid and whatever. I think if I went to one of the reporters or anchors at, you know, the Flint, Michigan station where I started and said, I studied thermodynamics. I have no idea what this means. Can you tell me what you do and how you do this? I would have learned even more. So I wish I would have done that earlier because that's what I do now. Rebecca Jarvis is a fantastic journalist who works in more, she does financial things a lot of times here for us. And her and I seem to have a lot of crossovers lately. And so I've been like, what, how'd you get to that source? How'd you get this? You know, and she's really good at, and we have a great collaborative relationship. And I think that's where I've gotten way better at saying, I have no idea how you got that. Help me out here. Can you, you know, and people are willing to do that because they want to, especially if they're on your same team. So I would say that that's what I do by asking questions. It's a very easy answer. Just ask more questions of your colleagues that are so good.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
I have one more question. If you could think about what was your most deadliest storm you've ever chased?
Well, deadliest, I guess, now is Ian, because the bushfires didn't kill as many, right, Sam, when we were there? In Australia, that's one. I don't think so. Yeah, I think it's Ian. 100 is a lot. So sorry, I'm just going over numbers, but I'm pretty sure that that would be the number one. Sorry, Katrina, duh.
Now, like to,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, to add like
Katrina.
now to add like another point to this, I also suffer from anxiety that like, cause I get scared sometimes. How do like meteorologists, especially storm chasers, overcome anxiety, especially when they're out chasing a specific, like a tornado or a hurricane or something like that?
So I will use both Katrina and Ian as examples because they have so many years between them, and I've grown so much in both my personal mental health and abilities because I've conditioned, right? I've worked really hard at maintaining the education and the treatment that I got. So to lay it out, so in Katrina time, I had not done any work on my own personal mental health. By Ian, I had not only gone through, 12 years ago, went to inpatient help and actually got a foundation and a treatment plan that worked for me for the next decade and made me the strongest, healthiest mentally. So that those were two very different things. But I was also in Katrina very early in my career. I had never seen a dead body before I went to Katrina. I did there, and I saw a dog die in front of me. It was a highly emotionally charged storm in general because, as I realized very quickly, on the way down there, my photographer and I was working for Wood TV, which is part of the Lynn. It was part of the Lynn television group, and so the intent was, hey, we're going to have you go down there, and you're going to cover for all of our 16 stations. I'd never done anything like that. I had never covered a hurricane, and it was Hurricane Katrina. And I show up in Gulfport hours after, I mean, right in the thick of when it was okay for media to come in, which was not okay, by the way. And we got in there, and I had never seen anything. And I went down there kind of like the nerd that I am, like, oh, I can't wait to see what a 22-foot water line looks like. Not at all having the concept of the impact to humans. It was so much about science so early in my career and about figuring out that puzzle that storm changed my why I do this. It was always like, oh, it's the science. No, it is about, yes, your passion for the science, but it is about the compassion because every story, especially that one, is about humans. And I was in Gulfport, and Gulfport took the brunt of the surge. If you remember, New Orleans was more the failure of the levees and such, and it happened hours later. Gulfport was that original, 150 people died directly in Gulfport. And seeing damage like that and seeing an entire really significant town wiped, right? Because the water was so powerful, was so big, and it was so heavy that for 7 days we were down there. We really couldn't have known what we were getting ourselves into. We didn't have enough food and water. I mean, we were like really rationing it for ourselves. We were telling 4 stories a day, around the clock shooting. We were, exhausted by the end for sure, incredibly dehydrated. Obviously, no bathrooms, no hotel. It was like the saddest, scariest campsite, because we slept in our van. And I had never done anything like that. And I came away from that storm, remember driving back, and I hadn't really let the emotion be. I thought that I needed to be some neutral, like very news person. And I got to the hotel where we were stopped in Tennessee or something, and we had gotten our first meal. And we had gotten to the hotel, and I went in the shower for the first time in 7 or 8 days. And I just started bawling. And it was like, oh my gosh, that was, it really, like, I had saved it up. And I see my son do this now, my older son, who's emotionally much more like me. I see him hold on to things, and then it releases. And it was like that storm. I don't know that I could have done anything different, except for maybe I would have allowed myself to feel when I was hugging people who had lost loved ones, which I do now. I mean, if somebody has lost someone and I naturally cry, I cry, because that's what we're supposed to do, right? This is awful, and it's sad, and all of those things. So take me then fast forward to actually Michael, 5 years ago, and here I am walking out of this eye wall of a Cat 5. Nothing. I was seeing things that I had only seen video of or read about in books, and watching people's homes twist up their foundation. And it was like my why changed again, because everybody I met on the way out of that one said, not like, you ask them, why did you stay here? And most of the time in Sandy and many other storms, I've had the people will say, well, I didn't think it was going to be as bad, or they've got the common excuses. And not in Michael, it was, I don't speak English, I don't have a car, I don't have family or anywhere to go, I didn't have a way to get to the shelter. And I was like, oh my gosh. So now my why is changing again, because we know, I stuck myself directly where we know exactly where the worst of it's going to be, in a great place. Why these people floated in life preservers for 4 hours in a storm is beyond me. This should not be happening. And so my why then changed. How do I help this not happen again? And what can I do on my end with communication, with making people understand how quickly surge happens, and then doing the rescue before the rescue. We know where we need to get people out of. The knock on doors needs to be followed by an offer of a bus or something that comes through. So I've been talking to a lot of the connections I've made through television to see how we can possibly do that. And that answers your question. The action changes what I feel after a storm. Because even after Ian, and you have 100 people or more, I'm forgetting the exact number, but I found myself right after being in the eye wall again of this Cat 4, and we get out the next morning, and we're in this neighborhood where a lot of seniors lived in these they're mobile homes, but they were on, they're just kind of slot homes, and they had flooded all the way to the top. And I knew people were dead around me. I knew they hadn't even checked these buildings. And I knew, as I was doing world news, and I was exhausted, and I didn't have communication, which usually hurts. That usually gets me like feeling not great. I knew that this was, unfortunately, this was not the case of people needing to be saved, that they had gotten people out, of the ones that wanted to leave, and the ones that had stayed, as I was told by the neighbors that did survive. They all said, I'm so stupid, I should have left when they told me to get out and I had the chance. So all to tell you that I have learned how to utilize my own protection of like taking care of myself, making sure I do the best that I can do in the job that I can do, and then using my connections. That action allows me to feel far less depressed or anxious or any of those feelings about these. And it makes me feel like actually responsibility, that I've got to go do this because I know what it takes, and my why has a purpose.
Alright, thank you.
All right,
Sure.
I have another question.
Okay.
So as someone,
Needs to take off, go ahead.
yeah, as someone.
Yeah,
who-
I'm gonna listen while I walk a little bit, if that's okay. Go ahead.
So as someone who is on air on the national stage, my roommate and I are having our first radio show on air today at school. And I know like Dan Harris and Matt
Mhm.
Kupton, they've had panic attacks.
Yeah.
Have you ever had that overwhelming fear, like, oh no, like I'm gonna be live in 5 minutes and then I'm gonna, have stage fright? Like, how do you overcome that, in the moment fear?
Yeah, I haven't had that fear about being on television. So I don't, and maybe I'm just wired slightly different. I do think that there's a whole host of reasons why that is. I've had anxiety and fear in many other parts of my life, but not as much in television. But what I do know is that I've had great success in being able to, when I do feel any increase in heart rate or a little nervousness, and usually it's more excited, to be honest, for me. I do find breath work and meditation are key. For me, that's key for a million reasons why. And I know it sounds very in the moment, like everybody's doing it. I've been now practicing meditation for about 5 years. I've had such success with the breathing tools that I've learned through guided meditation in many parts of life. And I just know from my friends, Dan and Matt, that those help in those panic situations, even though I can't relate. I haven't yet met a stage that I don't feel excited to get on. And I can't think of, I mean, Sam could probably tell you, I get nervous when I'm gonna, like, my breathing changes. She hears me breathe. That's how close we are, because she's
Wow.
I'm in her ear. And so she probably could tell you, I get nervous, but then I don't know. I'm not like, I don't ever have a panic moment. I don't ever have like and I get quiet. That's what she's telling me. We've never really talked about this. Thanks, guys. Thanks for bringing it up. I get quiet when I'm nervous.
Yeah.
Oh,
Like, but not really.
Mhm.
All right,
Yeah.
I think we're about out of time.
yes.
So
Thank you. I'm learning
so
about myself here.
much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you all so much too. Thanks for waiting, and I appreciate you all.
Thank
All right,
you.
talk to you later.
Oh, that's awesome.
Great.